here's the thing. Jesus was always hanging out with the wrong guys. He was hanging out at the pier with the guys with the red plastic cups, right? He was hanging out at the parties. And he's the kind of guy that right now we look at him and say, why are you with those people? What, you know, you got the tweakers and the potheads and the prostitutes, and Jesus is at their parties. And we know he wasn't the guy that was coming in and busting them all the time, because you don't invite that guy to your parties, right? So what happens though is all the good church people start coming up to Jesus all the time and saying, why? Why do you hang out with those people? What's wrong with you? Shouldn't you be with us? Like, those are the kind of people that when you drive through their part of town, you should be locking the car doors. But you prefer their company. Why is that? And Jesus says, well, it's because of this guy named Andy Johnson. He's a grade school teacher in Los Angeles. This is in Luke 15 if you want to follow along. It's straight out of the Bible. So Luke 15. Jesus says, you want to know why I hang out with these guys? It's because of this guy, Andy Johnson. He's a third grade teacher in Los Angeles. And the school he's at, it doesn't have any money. And the kids who go to the school, they don't have any money. Everyone's impoverished. And he looks at these kids, and a lot of them look at him, and they see him as sort of a father figure. And that's okay with Andy. He doesn't have kids, and a lot of them don't have fathers. And the one thing he wants is for these kids to have some sort of positive memory from their childhood. And he thinks to himself, what if I could do a field trip and take these kids to the zoo? That would be amazing. But the kids don't have money to go to the zoo. The school doesn't have any money to take them to the zoo, and Andy certainly doesn't have enough money to take them all to the zoo. So what he does is he goes around and he talks to all these different people, and he raises the money to take them. The school chips in a little bit, the zoo gives them a discount, a bus service donates their time, he gets a bunch of parents to chaperone, and pretty soon he's taking not just his third grade class, but all the third grade classes in the school, about 100 kids, right? And they're driving down to the San Diego Zoo, the best zoo in the world. And Andy and the kids are all excited, and the kids can't stop talking about it, all these different animals they're gonna see, the penguins, and the polar bears, and they're hoping there's a platypus because they heard they're really cool and funny, and all these things, right? And Andy, he's excited, but he's also a little stressed out. It's his first field trip. He's got 100 kids, and he keeps counting them sort of obsessively. So he's like 96, 97, 98, 99, 100. 96, 97, 98, 99, 100. I mean, he counts to 100 more times that day than those kids have ever counted to 100 in their entire lives, right? It's like a mantra. He's doing it over and over. And they get out and they go and look at the polar bears, and the kids are like, the penguins, we want to see the penguins, not the penguins yet. You know, we're going to go see the lions, we'll go this way to the giraffes, and they're walking around, and Andy keeps counting, and come lunchtime, they're all getting ready to sit down, and he starts to count, 96, 97, 98, 99. Oh, he must have miscounted. 96, 97, 98, 99. He thinks maybe because the kids are moving around, he's missing one. So he has them all sit down with their chaperones in small groups, and he counts them again, 96, 97, 98, 99, one is missing. Well, what do you think Andy does? 99 out of 100, that's still an A+. He's like, that's cool. We lost one, no big deal. 99%, teacher of the year. Well, no, of course not. What does Andy do? He gets the parents and he says, make a perimeter around the children. There's 99 of them here. So make a circle, and if one of them crosses this line, I want you to say, please go sit down, because this is public school and that's all we have the authority to do. And he realizes there's one kid missing, and he knows who it is. It's Roger Hom. Great kid, so kind, so loving, curious, and he's not surprised that Roger's the one that wandered off. He's curious. but he's surprised that he missed it. And he can't imagine this little third grade kid alone in the zoo, and all the worst things start going through his mind of what could have happened. And he starts running through the zoo and grabbing the passersby and saying, "Have you seen this kid Roger? He's about this tall, black hair, third grade." No one's seen him. He's stopping the workers. He's stopping everyone he sees. And he goes to all the places they've already been. And he starts running through the zoo to places they haven't been. And of course, he finds Roger standing in front of the penguins. Right? And he is so overwhelmed, so pleased, that he scoops Roger up in his arms. And he just holds him. And Roger looks at him with a surprised, confused, sort of happy look to get an unexpected hug from his teacher. And Andy puts Roger on his shoulders so that he can't get away. And he walks with him back to the class and the parents. And when the parents see him coming with Roger on his shoulders, this cheer goes up from the parents. And Jesus says, in the same way, there's more cheering in heaven over one lost person who's come home than over 99 who stayed in the right place. Now, the people who are asking the question, why are you hanging out with these messed up people, they're not satisfied with that, right? Right as Jesus says this, the guy next to him, takes a hit. And they're like, really? That's your answer? That's why you hang out with people who do drugs? Because once a kid got lost at the zoo. Right. So Jesus says, once there was this woman named Rosalba Arvizu. And she lived in Los Angeles in this broken down sort of tenement apartment. And she'd lived there a long time. She could barely afford the rent still. And one day she goes out to her mailbox, one of those mailboxes on the side like that. She opens her little grate and she reaches in and there's an envelope. And it's from her grandson, Humberto. And Humberto has gotten this amazing job up in Northern California working for some rancher who's incredibly generous to his workers. He not only gives them money, he gives them a clean place to live. He provides food. And somehow Humberto has managed to save up $500. And as she opens up the envelope, it says, "Abuelita para ti," and she pulls it out. $500. She hasn't held $500 bills in her hands and she can't remember when. And she's so overwhelmed by how incredible her grandson is. She goes up into her apartment, she puts on some hot water, and she sits down and she spreads the money out on this cracked little Formica table she has. And she looks at it, and she's so thankful. She gets up and pours herself something to drink and comes back and looks, and there's $400 bills. Something happened. She lost one. So she looks in the envelope again. She looks under the table, starts to look around in the kitchen, on the floor under the oven. She looks in the garbage. She started going into rooms in her apartment she hasn't even been in yet because she thinks, well, maybe. And then she goes, I have to ask my neighbors, maybe I dropped it in the hallway on the way. And she goes out and she knocks on her neighbor's door, old Mr. Pata, and he hasn't seen it. She goes over to the Hom's house next door, and they had a weird scare of their own that day, but they haven't seen the $100 bill either. She goes down the hall, and there's this apartment of these just impoverished young men. They're about her grandson's age, and they can't even afford an apartment on their own, and they do this thing where, as if they lived in a submarine or something, they rotate through the beds based on their work schedule. So they have to share even the beds. They're that poor, but they haven't seen the $100 either. And she looks everywhere. She goes back to her apartment, and she sits down just defeated. $400 is still amazing. And she opens up the envelope for the 500th time, and there it is. She missed it somehow. And she's so relieved and so excited that she goes around to all her neighbors and she says, I found it, I found it. Come to my house tonight, and I'm making tamales for everyone. And she does, she makes an incredible feast. And everyone comes and they eat and they're happy. And she sends all the leftovers home with those boys because they remind her of Umberto. And Jesus says, in the same way, it's just like that. God's people throw a party to celebrate one crumpled, torn, used up sinner who turns away from her old life and comes back to God. Now, still not enough. People are looking at Jesus skeptically. Sure, they've had that experience. They've lost something and found it. But really? That's your point? You tell this first story about this kid at the zoo, and yeah, I get it. You're saying that to God, the lost are precious. And then you tell this story about losing some money. Right. To God, the lost are valuable. I understand. I get what you're saying. That doesn't mean you need to be here at this party. And Jesus says, let me tell you one more. There was this kid named Frank. And Frank lived on this ranch in Northern California. His father was a rancher. His grandfather had been a rancher. His older brother was a rancher. And he was sick of it. Frank did not want to be a rancher. In fact, what Frank wanted more than anything was to go to Hollywood and become an actor. And he used to sometimes, he'd pull the combine over in the middle of the field when no one was there, and he'd pretend to be Hamlet. You know, he just loved it. Is this a dagger I see before me? And, you know, there was no one there to tell him if he was good or not, but he felt really good. And he knew his father was the one keeping him from going. And he and his father would have these fights, these incredible fights, that would just range for acres. And all the workers knew to stay away. And his older brother seemed to watch with a funny smirk on his face, like, ah, you idiot. He hated him. And one day, he's talking to his father, and his father realizes for the first time that what this is about is not about Frank leaving. He's already told him, if you want to go to Hollywood, go. It's about money. That Frank is wishing that he had his half of the ranch so he could take the money and go start his new life. And his father says to him, Frank, one day I'll be dead and you'll get your inheritance. And Frank says, I wish you were dead now. His father says, oh, Frank, you don't mean that. I do, Frank said, and the words sort of hung over their heads. Neither of them knew how to move back away from what had just been said. And Frank regretted it. Sure, of course he regretted it a little bit. But he was pleased the next morning when he saw that half the ranch was now for sale. And it wasn't long after that his father gave him the money that came from the sale of that half of the property. And Frank was a millionaire. And he moved to Los Angeles without another thought. He didn't even say goodbye. One of his friends picked him up and took him to the airport. And he moved down to Los Angeles, and it wasn't long before he met some other struggling actors, some wannabe directors, some almost producers, and they started having these incredible parties at his house. And he was just kind of waiting. He didn't have a job. He went to a couple, kind of applied here and there to be an actor. And the parties started getting bigger, more exciting. And yeah, there was alcohol, there was drugs, there were women, and it was a good life with lots of friends. He had a nice car, nice place to live, and he was burning through his money. And one morning he gets up, he hears someone outside, he thinks it's a thief maybe taking his awesome car, and he goes and he looks out. It's not at all, it's the repo man, because he's fallen behind on his payments. And he tries to stop him, it's too late. And he starts calling in, he's loaned out a bunch of money, so he starts calling in, hey guys, it's time to give the money back. Pretty soon it's not just calling in debts, he starts calling in favors. And after that, he starts taking welfare. Like he's just broke, and he can't find a job anywhere. Pretty soon all he has left is sort of this, he has a duffel bag with just, a handful of stuff in it, a couple changes of clothes, a couple $20 bills. And he finds himself living in this broken down tenement apartment with a bunch of other guys who have no money. And he finds a job, he does, he gets one. He takes a bus every morning before the sun rises, and he goes out down to the docks where the fishermen are getting ready to go out to fish, and he helps get the boats ready. And it's getting to the place that he doesn't have enough money to eat. In fact, the last good meal he had was this old lady in the tenement gave him a bunch of tamales, and they went through that pretty quickly, and he had a candy bar the day after that. But it's been 2 or 3 days since he's had anything to eat, and he catches himself one morning looking at a bucket of chum, fish parts. And he looks in and he hears in his mind, he hears himself say, I wonder what that tastes like. And that's the day. That's the day when he knew he needed to call home. And he thought to himself, man, my dad treats his workers so well. They get this nice clean room. He pays them. He feeds them meals. Like, my dad's migrant workers are better off than I am. So he gets on the phone, and his father, for whatever infuriating reason, never got a cell phone, so he has to leave a message on the ranch house phone. And he says, Dad, look, I screwed up. I messed up in front of you, in front of God, and I know there's no way you can forgive me. I don't expect you to take me back as your son, but if you could just give me a job. Anyway, I bought a Greyhound ticket with the last of my money, and I'm coming home. I'm coming to work. And he tells him the time that he'll be arriving. And he gets on that Greyhound bus, and it winds up over the grapevine, and it starts going down the other side. And he just sits there with his head up against the window, looking out at the stars, at the moon, and wondering to himself, how did I get here? How did that happen? How did I become this person? And he's imagining to himself what his father's going to say when he gets home. He's imagining, he's not even going to let him stay the night. He told him he wished he was dead. He took half the property and wasted the money. And he just imagines his father screaming at him. And he can't stand to think of the look on his brother's face. And they stop in Bakersfield. And he gets out and he's walking around the parking lot just thinking to himself. And the weirdest thing, he looks over and he sees this beat up old green pickup truck that looks just like his dad's. Well, he's not even halfway home yet. He's like, well, what can that's... And the door comes open and it's his father. And he thinks he's come to tell me not to bother. But then he sees his dad running across the parking lot, and he grabs him in his arms, and he says, as soon as I got your message, son. And that's all he can say. And they get back in the truck, and Frank can't believe it. He doesn't understand. And they're sitting there in the truck in silence, and he's thinking to himself, how can this be? How can my father love me this much? And they get to the house, and he has another surprise, because not only has his father brought him home, not only has he said to him, son, you're not going to be working for me. You're going to be working with me. But he must have called everyone in town and said that Frank was coming home, because there was an enormous party happening. The barn was open, the lights were on, music was playing, people were dancing, there was food. And his father said, son, go on in. And he did. He went in and began to dance with unspeakable joy. And Jesus looks at those who are asking the question. And he says, look, God looks at the lost. And he says, they're precious. God looks at the lost and he says, they're valuable. God looks at the lost and he says, they're like my children that have run away, and I want them to come home. Well, Frank's dad starts to look around the party, though, and he sees that not everyone's there. In fact, Frank's brother is missing. And he says to Umberto, hey, run over and find my older son. Tell him to come into the party. Tell him his brother's home. And Umberto does that, and he comes back and he says, hey, he says he doesn't want to come in. And Frank's father says, all right. So he goes out in the field where his other son is just standing there, just kind of looking out over the fields. He says, son, are you coming in? And he says, Dad, my whole life, I've only ever done anything you've asked me to, and you've never even given me and my friends a frozen pizza. And now this guy comes home? The guy who wasted our money on whores? And you throw a party? Have you even yelled at him yet? And his father says, son, look at these fields. Look at that barn. Look at the house, that truck, the combine. Everything I have is yours. Everything I have, it's yours. But your brother, we never heard from him. He didn't send emails. He didn't call. He didn't write. It's like he was dead to us. Do you understand what just happened? He might as well have been buried out here in one of your fields, and then one day we walk along to bring flowers to the grave and we see it's dug up. And then we hear someone whistling and we turn and look and it's him walking down the road to us. How can we not celebrate that? How can we not have a party? He was lost and he's come home. He was dead and he's alive.